welcome to today's Explainer. Look, we are currently tracking a massive structural economic shift that is quietly but completely rewiring global trade. We're standing on the edge of a new era of absolute industrial transparency. And the crazy part is, the catalyst for this isn't some Silicon Valley tech breakthrough. It's actually a bold, multi-billion-dollar regulatory move pioneered by the European Union. By the end of this analysis, we're going to break down exactly how a single carbon tariff mechanism is effectively flipping the global supply chain completely inside out and exposing data that has literally been fiercely hidden for centuries. So think about this for a second. What if the world's heaviest industries simply had no place to hide? I mean, for generations, global manufacturing has operated super comfortably behind closed factory doors. Supply chains were these tangled webs spanning multiple continents, and they were designed primarily for cost efficiency, definitely not for clarity. When a product finally arrived at a port, its history was largely a total mystery. But what happens when a new financial mechanism starts acting like a giant, inescapable spotlight? Suddenly, that spotlight is shining directly into the deepest, darkest corners of the global manufacturing floor, and it's forcing a level of systemic disclosure that the industrial sector has never, ever experienced before. All right, let's dive into part one, the industrial opacity problem. Heavy industry has historically operated as a complete black box. For decades, when a massive multinational corporation imported, say, 1,000 tons of steel, aluminum, or cement, they were essentially just buying a finished commodity. The entire complex web leading up to that final product operated firmly in the shadows. We're talking about the specific factories, the precise mix of coal or renewables on the local energy grids powering those plants, and the geopolitical origins of the raw materials pulled straight from the earth. All of this was largely shielded from public and regulatory scrutiny. And honestly, this opacity provided a really convenient layer of plausible deniability. Companies could claim clean operations locally while just offshoring their massive Scope 3 supply chain emissions to regions with totally lax environmental standards. Hidden emissions were simply considered a standard, unavoidable byproduct of scaling a global business. Moving right along to Section 2, defining CBAM. Okay, let's unpack this acronym. The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, is the framework designed to absolutely shatter that historical black box. Created by the European Union, CBAM places a direct tariff on carbon-intensive products imported into its jurisdiction. To really get why this matters, we have to look at the EU's internal market. European manufacturers already pay a high price for their carbon emissions under the EU Emissions Trading System, or ETS. Historically, this created a pretty major competitive disadvantage because cheaper, dirtier products were just flooding in from abroad without facing those same environmental costs. So CBAM fixes this by levying a border tax that precisely mirrors that internal carbon price. If a non-EU manufacturer wants to sell their steel in Europe, they have to pay a toll at the border that explicitly accounts for the carbon emitted during its production. It's essentially a financial tool designed to level the economic playing field and prevent what economists call carbon leakage. Which brings us to Section 3, the data collection engine. Now here's the million-dollar question. If a customs officer tells a foreign manufacturer they owe a tax based on the specific carbon footprint of a shipment of cement, the immediate logical hurdle is, how do you definitively prove it? Because you obviously can't tax what you can't accurately measure. And measuring carbon emissions across complex, sovereign borders, that is a massive jurisdictional nightmare. A customs agency in Rotterdam can't exactly send an inspector to a smelting plant halfway across the globe. Therefore, to actually enforce this financial penalty, the regulators had to mandate the creation of a vast standardized data pipeline. Simply put, you cannot calculate the global emissions toll without entirely ripping the lid off the industrial black box. So, to get a carbon-intensive product across an EU border today, a company must navigate this incredibly rigorous multi-stage data audit. Picture a spool of industrial aluminum manufactured in a foreign facility destined for a European automaker. Step 1 requires meticulous tracking of the direct manufacturing emissions at the specific plant where that aluminum was forged. Step 2 mandates deep supply chain energy auditing. The manufacturer has to prove exactly where their power came from. Was it a local coal-fired plant or maybe a nearby hydroelectric dam? And step 3 is the granular border declaration, where all this certified data is legally submitted right at the port of entry. This whole process effectively creates a highly detailed, mandatory nutrition label for heavy industry. It's no longer enough to just declare a product's weight and value. Companies now have to legally certify exactly how it was baked. The sheer volume and granularity of this required exposure is just unprecedented. I mean, companies worldwide are now legally obligated to expose their specific energy sources, their proprietary manufacturing processes, their highly intricate supply chain logistics, and the exact origins of their raw materials. Historically, this type of data was fiercely guarded as top-tier corporate intelligence. Having a unique, highly efficient smelting process or a lucrative, under-the-radar supplier network that represented a massive competitive advantage. Or, alternatively, the data was simply ignored because tracking it across thousands of global vendors was deemed technologically and logistically impossible. Well, not anymore. Now exposing this deeply embedded corporate intelligence is a strict, non-negotiable requirement just to maintain access to one of the world's absolute largest consumer markets. Let's look at what this creates in Section 4, a new transparent economy. We are witnessing a hard, systemic pivot right now. The old global economy was defined by absolute opacity. It relied on heavily fragmented data sets and hidden, totally untraceable industrial processes. It was an environment where environmental accountability was largely voluntary and, let's be honest, pretty easily manipulated. The new economy being forced into existence by CBAM represents a complete 180-degree turn. It is fundamentally transparent. It mandates standardized, heavily audited reporting across dozens of different nations and demands clear, unavoidable accountability for every single ton of carbon produced. The fragmented industrial black box of the 20th century is rapidly and irreversibly transforming into the data-driven, globally interconnected glass house of the 21st century. As noted beautifully by the channel Genecapsule, this tectonic shift may ultimately create, quote, the world's most transparent industrial economy. And that really hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures the massive, completely unintended structural consequence of this policy. What originally started out as a highly specific financial tool to prevent carbon leakage and protect domestic European industries is effectively evolving into the greatest industrial data mining operation in human history. By forcing global suppliers to aggressively audit their own operations just to remain competitive, this policy is illuminating the entire global supply chain from the inside out. Finally, Section 5, why this matters now. So while the direct financial impact of the border tax itself is heavily debated, and obviously it's definitely significant to the companies actually paying it, the broader global data transparency impact is absolutely massive by comparison. This secondary effect just vastly outweighs the initial financial intent. Because consider this, a tariff rate might fluctuate over the years, right? Or a multinational company might figure out some complex financial workaround to absorb the cost of the tax. However, once that comprehensive data infrastructure is built, and once those standardized reporting metrics for industrial processes are globally established, that information can never be put back into the box. This new baseline of absolute data transparency permanently alters the fundamental operating physics of global trade. Mandating this level of transparency triggers a profound ripple effect across the entire market. First, it forces unavoidable global supply chain honesty. Multinationals can no longer just offshore their heavy pollution to unregulated markets and present a squeaky clean public image. The audited data explicitly ties the origin emissions directly to the final product sitting on the shelf. Second, this sudden visibility rapidly accelerates competitive green innovation. When carbon footprints are totally public and directly tied to market access, the market actually sees and financially rewards the most efficient manufacturers. A steelmaker who invests heavily in modern electric arc furnaces suddenly has a tangible, measurable market advantage over a competitor still dragging their feet with traditional, highly polluting blast furnaces. And finally, this standardized data pipeline systematically eliminates those long-standing environmental loopholes, ensuring that carbon accounting actually relies on hard, verifiable truth rather than clever corporate PR. So as the heavy industrial supply chains of the world transform from impenetrable black boxes into brightly lit glass houses, a really critical dynamic emerges. Who will actually thrive in this new transparent economy? Will it be the heavily entrenched legacy giants, the ones struggling to re-engineer their historically opaque operations? Or will it be the agile modern innovators who already possess the clean data and efficient processes to operate with absolutely nothing to hide? It's going to be fascinating to watch. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. And hey, keep an eye on those supply chains.